Hey everybody. Pardon the glare. Um, yeah, it's just one of those things. Bowie has come to see me. Bowie, you like to say hello to everyone? Yeah. Okay. Good. It's fine. Okay. So I just spent about 15 minutes trying to answer some of your questions, and then I realized I cannot add it to this video, so that's a problem for me um, because I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to try to recall as many of your questions as I possibly can. In terms of the colors, why are the colors important? We've got a footnote at one of the moments where colors are referred to, and that's going to highlight um, that a lot of your questions are already answered for you if you follow the footnotes. So, colors, if you turn to page 11, and on page 11 of your book, and it's about the middle of that last paragraph, on the far right hand side of the page, Marlowe describes deal table in the middle, plain chairs all round the walls, on one end a large shining map marked with all the colors of a rainbow. And then he goes on and describes what the colors of the rainbow are. So then, if you go to the back of your book for the notes, and you're looking specifically at part one, and it's number 29, I believe, what I just saw. He describes that the red are British, uh, French are blue, the Portuguese are orange, the Italians are green, the Germans are purple, and the Belgians are yellow. And he is going into King Leopold's Congolese territory at the turn of the century. So that's when and where we are. Lots of people asking about the frame narrative. So the narrator in the frame narrative sets up the frame of the narrative, and the narrative is the painting, and Marlowe is creating the painting. He is creating the impressionist painting of the story. Um, Somebody asked, does Marlowe have any friends? Yeah, he's with his friends on this boat, and so they're on this boat, sitting on the Thames. They're at anchor, and they were about to go off on this journey, but Marlowe starts telling this compelling story. And so they don't play their dominoes. They don't do anything else but listen to this story. And so lots of questions about so why do we even have a frame narrator in the first place? It's because it's to set up a filter. You have to listen to Marlowe's story. So you're there on the boat with everybody else. Um, Questions about Marlowe's perspective regarding imperialism before he goes to Africa. Before he even goes to Africa, he seems to have a negative opinion about imperialism. How is that the case? You have to remember Marlowe has already had this experience. So he's telling the story after he has had the experience. So the experience that you are hearing is one that is filtered through what he has already experienced. He's had this experience. He knows what he's going to tell us. In terms of the things that he talks about, they're important for the reasons that they're important. So I need for you to, be thoughtful about the questions that you're asking. And what are the questions that you absolutely need to have answered of what you submitted? I gave you a document in today's agenda that I think clarifies a lot, that asks you to do a lot of deep thinking, um, and hopefully that clarifies things. But if not, if your question did not get answered, if the question that you need to have answered before you can continue on did not get answered, then please submit that to the discussion tab, um, or bring it to one of our Zoom meetings. Now, the Whited Sepulchre, the city of the Whited Sepulchre is important. It is one of the most important elements of the story. This too has been one of the dark places of the earth. But the city of Brussels, Belgium, reminds Marlowe of a whited sepulchre. Now, the whited sepulchre, it's an illusion It's a biblical allusion to a story of hypocrisy. It means hypocrisy, but it is also literally a white tomb, and inside of a tomb there are dead bodies. And so I want you to be thinking about Joseph Campbell and what Joseph Campbell says about uh, the the biggest building in the place. And so, if the biggest building in a place happens to be a whited sepulcher, what is Joseph Conrad as an author saying in putting those words in Marlowe's mouth? Okay, so I'm going to start reading to you now, and I'm going to be marking and highlighting. And when I'm done with that, the marking and highlighting, we'll try to figure out what page we're on. And so it's 10:24 according to Mike's timestamp, and we'll go till about 11. And hopefully I can remember to keep looking at the time. So we left off page 23 with Marlowe saying, "Next day I left that station at last with a caravan of 60 men for a 200-mile tramp." And so we are right here. So let me grab my pen. No use telling you much about that. Paths everywhere. A stamped in network of paths spreading over the empty land, through the long grass, through burnt grass, through thickets, down and up chilly ravines, up and down stony hills ablaze with heat, and a solitude. A solitude. Nobody. Not a hut. The population had cleared out a long time ago. Well, if a lot of the mysterious Negroes, armed with all kinds of fearful weapons, suddenly took to traveling on the road between Deal and Gravesend, catching the yokels right and left to carry heavy loads for them, I fancy every farm and cottage thereabouts would get empty very soon. Only here, the dwellings were gone too. Still, I passed through several abandoned villages. There's something pathetically childish in the ruins of grass walls. Day after day, with the stamp and shuffle of 60 pair of bare feet behind me, each pair under a 60-pound load. Camp, cook, sleep, strike camp, march. Now and then a carrier dead in harness, at rest in the long grass near the path, with an empty water gourd and his long staff lying by his side. A great silence around and above, perhaps on some quiet night, the tremor of far off drums, sinking, swelling, a tremor vast, faint, a sound weird, appealing, suggestive, and wild, and perhaps with as profound a meaning as the sound of bells in a Christian country. Once a white man in an unbuttoned uniform, camping on the path with an armed escort of lank Zanzibaris, very hospitable and festive, not to say drunk, was looking after the upkeep of the road, he declared. Can't say I saw any road or any upkeep, unless the body of a middle aged Negro with a bullet hole in the forehead, upon which I absolutely stumbled 3 miles farther on, may be considered as a permanent improvement. I had a white companion, too, not a bad chap, but rather too fleshy, and with the exasperating habit of fainting on the hot hillsides, miles away from the least bit of shade and water. Annoying, you know, to hold your own coat like a parasol over a man's head while he is coming to. I couldn't help asking him once what he meant by coming there at all. To make money, of course. What do you think? He said scornfully. Then he got fever and had to be carried in a hammock slung under a pole. As he weighed 16 stone, I had no end of rows with the carriers. They jibbed, ran away, sneaked off with their loads in the night. Quite a mutiny. So one evening I made a speech in English with gestures, not one of which was lost to the 60 pairs of eyes before me, and the next morning I started the hammock off in front all right. An hour afterwards, I came upon the whole concern wrecked in a bush, man, hammock, groans, blankets, horrors. The heavy pole had skinned his poor nose. He was very anxious for me to kill somebody, but there wasn't the shadow of a carrier near. I remembered the old doctor. It would be interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. I felt I was becoming scientifically interesting. However, all that is to no purpose. On the 15th day, I came in sight of the big river again and hobbled into the central station. It was on a backwater surrounded by scrub and forest, with a pretty border of smelly mud on one side, and on the three others enclosed by a crazy fence of rushes. A neglected gap was all the gate it had, and the first glance at the place was enough to let you see the flabby devil was running that show. White men with long staves in their hands appeared languidly from amongst the buildings, strolling up to take a look at me and then retired out of sight somewhere. One of them, a stout, excitable chap with black mustaches, informed me with great volubility and many digressions as soon as I told him who I was, that my steamer was at the bottom of the river. I was thunderstruck. What? How? Why? Oh, it was all right. The manager himself was there, all quite correct. Everybody had behaved splendidly, splendidly. You must, he said in agitation, go and see the general manager at once. He is waiting. So there's some interesting things going on in this paragraph, but one of the most important ones is this bit of business here. It would be interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. I felt I was becoming scientifically interesting. Now, somebody asked me what happened with Freslevin. That answers your question. Somebody asked, why did the Swede hang himself? That answers your question. Okay. So, what is going on to Marlowe's mind? And he hasn't even started his job yet. Okay. What is happening to Marlowe? Think about that. He's not even been there for 2 weeks. On the 15th day, I came in sight of the big river again. Okay. So 14 days, 2 weeks. He's becoming scientifically interesting. He's starting to lose his mind because of how insane everything is that surrounds him. The Flabby Devil is running the show here at this new interstation. And these white men, what do they do? What do they do? They just come out, stroll up, look, turn around. That's it. I imagine these guys to come out with their mouths open, just all okay. So that's what I'm seeing. And we've learned what Marlowe's job is. His steamer was at the bottom of the river. He's going to be a riverboat pilot. Trustworthiness personified. Don't forget that. That's his job. So, I did not see the real significance of that wreck at once. Now, that sounds very familiar. And hopefully, the reason that it sounds familiar is because you remember what I asked you to write about in your notes about Impressionism and the relationship with the Orwell piece. I did not see the real significance of that wreck at once. I fancy I see it now. So don't forget, again, this is happening. This has already happened. And so when Marlowe says, I fancy I see it now, that's as he's telling the story. Now, oh, oh, well, that I think I think I might see that now, but I'm not sure. Not at all. Certainly the affair was too stupid when I think of it to be altogether natural. So there's something that he's suggesting here. And so I want you to be thinking about, what is it that he might be suggesting here? Still, but at the moment, it presented itself simply as a confounded nuisance. The steamer was sunk. They had started 2 days before in a sudden hurry up the river with a manager on board in charge of some volunteer skipper. And before they had been out 3 hours, they tore the bottom out of her on stones, and she sank near the south bank. I asked myself what I was to do there now my boat was lost. As a matter of fact, I had plenty to do in fishing my command out of the river. I had to set about it the very next day. That and the repairs when I brought the pieces to the station took some months. So now his job originally was supposed to be riverboat pilot, but now he's going to have to fix his boat. That's his new job. Um, so I want you to notice here We've got some thinking going on. We've got the M dashes, okay? So the syntactical structure of this here, and then the ellipses. This is Marlowe thinking as he is telling the story. What is it that he has to convey? Notice how he's processing what it is that he's saying. My first interview with a manager was curious. He did not ask me to sit down after my 20-mile walk that morning. He was commonplace in complexion, in features, in manners, and in voice. He was of middle size and of ordinary build. His eyes, of the usual blue, were perhaps remarkably cold, and he certainly could make his glance fall on one as trenchant and heavy as an axe. But even at these times, the rest of his person seemed to disclaim the intention. Says the manager is just plain, 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 plain. Okay. Otherwise, there was only an indefinable, faint expression of his lips, something stealthy, a smile, not a smile. I remember it, but I can't explain. It was unconscious, this smile was. Though, just after he had said something, it got intensified for an instant. It came at the end of his speeches like a seal applied on the words to make the meaning of the commonest phrase appear absolutely inscrutable. He was a common trader, from his youth up, employed in these parts. Nothing more. He was obeyed, yet he inspired neither love nor fear, nor even respect. He inspired uneasiness. That was it. Uneasiness. Not a definite mistrust, just uneasiness. Nothing more. You have no idea how effective such a uh, faculty can be. He had no genius for organizing, for initiative, or for order, even. That was evident in such things as the deplorable state of the station. He had no learning and no intelligence. His position had come to him. Why? Perhaps because he was never ill. He had served 3 terms of 3 years out there. Because triumphant health and the general rout of constitutions is a kind of power in itself. When he went home on leave, he rioted on a large scale, pompously, Jack ashore with a difference in externals only. This one could gather from his casual talk. He originated nothing. He could keep the routine going. That's all. Oh, but he was great. He was great by this little thing that it was impossible to tell what could control such a man. He never gave that secret away. Perhaps there was nothing within him. Such a suspicion made one pause, for out there were no external checks. Once, when various tropical diseases had laid low almost every agent in the station, he was heard to say, "Men who come out here should have no entrails." He sealed the utterance with that smile of his, as though it had been a door opening into a darkness he had in his keeping. You fancied you had seen things, but the seal was on. When annoyed at mealtimes by the constant quarrels of the white men about precedence, he ordered an immense round table to be made, for which a special house had to be built. This was the station's mess room. Where he sat was the first place. The rest were nowhere. One felt this to be his unalterable conviction. He was neither civil nor uncivil. He was quiet. He allowed his boy, an overfed young Negro from the coast, to treat the white men under his very eyes with provoking insolence. So this manager, he's an interesting dude. Very plain. He's not intelligent. He's not smart. He's not a good leader. Ultimately, he has that position because he's able to survive. He was great by this little thing that it was impossible to tell what could control such a man. He was great. He was in that position because nobody could understand him. Really bizarre, right? So keep that in mind. Let's see here. There was something else. Ah, this bit of business. Perhaps there was nothing in him. Men who come out here should have no entrails. Now, there's something that I want you to remember, and you might have to dig for it. So look back at your shooting an elephant. There's a phrase that Orwell uses in Shooting an Elephant that describes this kind of person. He began to speak as soon as he saw me. I had been very long on the road. He could not wait. Had to start without me. The upriver stations had to be relieved. There had been so many delays already that he did not know who was dead and who was alive and how they got on and so on and so on. He paid no attention to my explanations and playing with a stick of sealing wax repeated several times that the situation was very grave. Very grave. There were rumors that a very important station was in jeopardy and its chief, Mr. Kurtz, was ill. Hoped it was not true. Mr. Kurtz was. I felt weary and irritable. Don't forget, he just marched for 20 miles. Manager did not invite him to sit down. Hang Kurtz, I thought. I interrupted him by saying I had heard of Mr. Kurtz on the coast. Ah, so they talk of him down there, he murmured to himself. Then he began again. Okay, I think we've started again. My apologies. Doors were slamming in our house from the wind, and the dog started to bark. So hang Kurtz, I thought. I interrupted him by saying I had heard of Mr. Kurtz on the coast. Ah, so they talk of him down there, he murmured to himself. Then he began again, assuring me Mr. Kurtz was the best agent he had, an exceptional man of the greatest importance to the company. Therefore, I could understand his anxiety. So keep in mind how Mr. Kurtz is being characterized. Characterization is key to our understanding of this text. He was, he said, very, very uneasy. Certainly he fidgeted on his chair a good deal, exclaimed, Ah, Mr. Kurtz, broke the stick of sealing wax and seemed dumbfounded by the accident. Next thing he wanted to know, how long would it take to? I interrupted him again, being hungry, and kept on my feet, too. I was getting savage. So please don't lose sight of that description, self characterization. How can I tell? I said. I haven't even seen the wreck yet. Some months, no doubt. All this talk seemed to me so futile. Some months, he said. Well, let us say 3 months before we can make a start. Yes, that ought to do the affair. I flung out of his hut. He lived all alone in a clay hut with a sort of veranda, muttering to myself my opinion of him. He was a chattering idiot. Afterwards, I took it back when it was borne in upon me startlingly with what extreme nicety he had estimated the time requisite for the affair. I went to work the next day, turning, so to speak, my back on that station. Now, this turn of phrase is also an important one. What does it mean to turn your back on your station? We've talked about knowing your place. Marlowe is turning his back on that station. In that way only, it seemed to me I could keep my hold on the redeeming facts of life. Some of you noticed that Marlowe is looking for truth, and he sees it in the natives, but he does not see it in the Europeans. Still, one must look about sometimes, and then I saw this station. These men strolling aimlessly about in the sunshine of the yard. I asked myself sometimes what it all meant. They wandered here and there with their absurd long staves in their hands, like a lot of faithless pilgrims bewitched inside a rotten fence. The word ivory rang in the air, was whispered, was sighed. Ivory. You would think they were praying to it. A taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all, like a whiff from some corpse. By Jove, I've never seen anything so unreal in my life. And outside, the silent wilderness surrounding this cleared speck on the earth struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for the passing away of this fantastic invasion. So, what is it that the jungle, silent wilderness, is waiting for. What is this fantastic invasion? Oh, these months. Well, never mind. Various things happened. One evening, a grass shed full of calico, cotton prints, beads, and I don't know what else, burst into a blaze so suddenly that you would have thought the earth had opened to let an avenging fire consume all that trash. I was smoking my pipe quietly by my dismantled steamer and saw them all cutting capers in the light with their arms lifted high when the stout man with mustaches came tearing down to the river, a tin pail in his hand, assured me that everybody was behaving splendidly, splendidly, dipped about a quart of water, and tore back again. I noticed there was a hole in the bottom of his pail. There's a hole in the bottom of his pail. So, I want you to think about the French steamer that's shooting into the coast. I want you to think about blowing up cliffs that are not in the way or anything and digging holes for the sole purpose of giving the prisoners something to do. And now they're trying to put out fires with pails that have holes in the bottom of them. What happened to Freslevin? What is happening to Marlowe? I strolled up. There was no hurry. You see, the thing had gone off like a box of matches. It had been hopeless from the very first. The flame had leaped high, driven everybody back, lighted up everything, and collapsed. The shed was already a heap of embers glowing fiercely. A Negro was being beaten nearby. They said he had caused the fire in some way. Be that as it may, he was screeching most horribly. I saw him later for several days, sitting in a bit of shade, looking very sick, and trying to recover himself. Afterwards, he arose and went out, and the wilderness, without a sound, took him into its bosom again. As I approached the glow from the dark, I found myself at the back of two men, talking. I heard the name of Kurtz pronounced, then the words, "Take advantage of this unfortunate accident." Notice the quotation marks. So he's hearing this dialogue. Okay. One of the men was the manager. I wished him a good evening. Did you ever see anything like it, hey? It is incredible, he said, and walked off. The other man remained. He was a first class agent, young, gentlemanly, a bit reserved, with a forked little beard and a hooked nose. So this character description is important. I want you to think about figures who might have a forked little beard and a hooked nose from previous readings that you've had or seen. He was standoffish with the other agents, and they, on their side, said he was the manager's spy upon them. As to me, I had hardly ever spoken to him before. We got into talk, and by, as we strolled away from the hissing agents, or from the hissing ruin, then he asked me to his room, which was in the main building of the station. He struck a match, and I perceived that this young aristocrat had not only a silver mounted dressing case, but also a whole candle all to himself. Just at that time, the manager was the only man supposed to have any right to candles. Native mats covered the clay walls, a collection of spears, assagais, shields, knives was hung up in trophies. The business entrusted to this fellow was the making of bricks. So I had been informed. But there wasn't a fragment of a brick anywhere in the station. And he had been there more than a year, waiting. It seems he could not make bricks without something. I don't know what. Straw, maybe. Anyway, it could not be found there, and as it was not likely to be sent from Europe, it did not appear clear to me what he was waiting for. Act of special creation, perhaps. However, they were all waiting, all the 16 or 20 pilgrims of them, for something. And upon my word, it did not seem an uncongenial occupation from the way they took it, though the only thing that ever came to them was disease, as far as I could see. They beguiled the time by backbiting and intriguing against each other in a foolish kind of way. There was an air of plotting about that station, but nothing came of it, of course. It was as unreal as everything else, as the philanthropic pretense of the whole concern, as their talk, as their government, as their show of work. The only real feeling was a desire to get appointed to a trading post where ivory was to be had, so that they could earn percentages. They intrigued and slandered and hated each other only on that account. But as to effectually lifting a little finger, oh no, by heavens. There is something, after all, in the world allowing one man to steal a horse, while another must not look at a halter. Steal a horse straight out, very well, he's done it, perhaps he can ride. But there is a way of looking at a halter that would provoke the most charitable of saints into a kick. So, this business here of describing our brickmaker who doesn't make bricks, again, you want to be thinking about the French man of war shooting into the coast, blowing up cliffs that aren't in the way or anything, um, uh, digging holes, putting out fires with pails that have holes in the bottom of them, and then brickmakers who don't make bricks. Okay, so keep that in mind. Be thinking about that, and the fact that none of these people do any work. None of them. Nobody does any work. Why? Because they can get away with it. They don't have to. They don't have to do any work. I had no idea why he wanted to be sociable. But as we chatted in there, it suddenly occurred to me the fellow was trying to get at something. In fact, pumping me. He alluded constantly to Europe, to the people I was supposed to know there, putting leading questions as to my acquaintances in the sepulchral city and so on. His little eyes glittered like mica discs with curiosity, though he tried to keep up a bit of superciliousness. At first, I was astonished, but very soon I became awfully curious to see what he would find out from me. I couldn't possibly imagine what I had in me to make it worth his while. It was very pretty to see how he baffled himself, for in truth my body was full only of chills, and my head had nothing in it but that wretched steamboat business. It was evident he took me for a perfectly shameless prevaricator. At last he got angry, and to conceal a movement of furious annoyance, he yawned. I rose. Then I noticed a small sketch in oils on a panel representing a woman draped and blindfolded carrying a lighted torch. The background was somber, almost black. The movement of the woman was stately, and the effect of the torchlight on the face was sinister. Lots of business going on here that I love, and the fact that Marlowe is stunned that he thinks that this guy thinks that Marlowe has information. Marlowe's like, I don't have any information. But you got to think about how Marlowe has been sold to people, how his aunt talked about him, and how he feels like an imposter. And so, there's lots of connections that are going on throughout the story. Everything that we've been told so far, we have been told for a reason. In terms of our brickmaker here, he is irritated because he's not getting any kind of information. Sorry, Bowie started barking again. I think our cat is teasing her. um, and then we have this painting. Um, Panel representing a woman draped and blindfolded carrying a lighted torch. And that reminds me of the painting that you may have seen in your US history books of the painting of Manifest Destiny, where she's bringing light to the dark corners of the world. Let's see here. The movement of the woman was stately, and the effect of the torchlight on the face was sinister. So that's something weird going on there with that painting. It arrested me, and he stood by civilly, holding an empty half-pint champagne bottle, medical comforts, with a candle stuck in it. To my question, he said Mr. Kurtz had painted this in this very station more than a year ago, while waiting for means to go to his trading post. Tell me, pray, said I, who is this Mr. Kurtz? Don't forget, Marlowe's only heard the name. Chief of the interstation, he answered in a short tone, looking away. Much obliged, I said, laughing, and you are the brickmaker of the central station. Everyone knows that. So notice the joke that goes on there. You are the brickmaker of the central station. So for the brickmaker to tell Marlowe that he's the chief of the interstation, Marlowe's telling the brickmaker, "You've told me nothing. You haven't told me a thing. You haven't told me a damn thing because you're the brickmaker, and that doesn't mean that you make bricks. What does the chief of the interstation do?" He was silent for a while. He is a prodigy. Now, you want to mark this in your book, wherever, whatever page that is. He is a prodigy, he said at last. He is an emissary of pity and science and progress and devil knows what else. We want, he began to declaim suddenly, for the guidance of the cause entrusted to us by Europe, so to speak, higher intelligence, wide sympathies, a singleness of purpose. So we wanted these things. Who says that? I asked. Lots of them, he replied. Some even write that. And so he comes here, a special being, as you ought to know. So people write to Europe and say, we want this kind of person. We want somebody who's smarter than us, with wide sympathies, a singleness of purpose. So they write that, and Kurtz shows up. Does that mean Kurtz is the response to that request? Or does he just show up at the right time? And so he comes here, being, a special being, as you ought to know. As you ought to know. So the special being part and the as you ought to know, both important. How did Marlowe refer to Freslevin? He refers to him as supernatural. Kurtz is a special being, as Marlowe ought to know. Why ought I to know? I interrupted, really surprised. Really surprised. He paid no attention. Yes, today he is chief of the best station. Next year he'll be assistant manager, 2 years more. But I dare say, you know what he will be in 2 years' time. You are of the new gang, the gang of virtue. The same people, mark this, the same people who sent him, the same people who sent Kurtz, specially, also recommended you. You and Mr. Kurtz. You and Mr. Kurtz. Oh, yay, Mr. Kurtz. Oh, don't say no. I have my own eyes to trust. Light dawned upon me. My dear aunt's influential acquaintances were producing an unexpected effect upon that young man. I nearly burst into a laugh. Do you read the company's confidential correspondence? I asked. He hadn't a word to say. It was great fun. When Mr. Kurtz, I continued severely, is general manager, you won't have the opportunity. But now there's a threat coming from Marlowe to the brickmaker who doesn't make bricks. He blew the candle out suddenly. We went outside. The moon had risen. Black figures strolled about listlessly, pouring water on the glow, whence proceeded a sound of hissing. Steam ascended in the moonlight. The beaten negro groaned somewhere. What a row the brute makes, said the indefatigable man with the mustaches, appearing near us. Serve him right. Transgression, punishment. Bang. Pitiless. Pitiless. That's the only way. This will prevent all conflagrations for the future. I was just telling the manager. He noticed my companion and became crestfallen all at once. Not in bed yet, he said, with a kind of servile heartiness. It's so natural. Ha! Danger! Agitation! He vanished. I went on to the riverside, and the other followed me. I heard a scathing murmur at my ear. Heap of muffs, go to! The pilgrims could be seen in knots, gesticulating, discussing. Several had still their staves in their hands. I verily believe they took these sticks to bed with them. Beyond the fence, the forest stood up spectrally in the moonlight, and through that dim stir, through the faint sounds of that lamentable courtyard, the silence of the land went home to one's very heart. Its mystery, its greatness, the amazing reality of its concealed life. The hurt negro moaned feebly somewhere nearby. and then fetched a deep sigh that made me mend my pace away from there. I felt a hand introducing itself under my arm. "My dear sir," said the fellow, "I don't want to be misunderstood, and especially by you, who will see Mr. Kurtz long before I can have that pleasure. I wouldn't like him to get a false idea of my disposition." So the brickmaker is trying to uh, make nice as much as he can with Marlowe here. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to be misunderstood. I let him run on, this paper mache Mephistopheles, and it seemed to me that if I tried, I could poke my forefinger through him and would find nothing inside but a little loose dirt, maybe. So, this description of the brickmaker, again, very important. Those of you who read Dr. Faustus ought to be able to share with the rest of us who Mephistopheles is. If you don't, you can also Google Mephistopheles. Paper mache. What are the qualities of paper mache? Well, it's empty. It's hollow. Again, go back to shooting an elephant. And this description. If I tried, I could poke my forefinger through him and would find nothing inside but a little loose dirt. He, brickmaker, don't you see, had been planning to be assistant manager by and by under the present man, and I could see that the coming of that Kurtz had upset them both, not a little. So nice, effective use of litotes here. So they're both bothered a lot by the appearance of Mr. Kurtz. He talked precipitately, and I did not try to stop him. I had my shoulders against the wreck of my steamer, hauled up on the slope like a carcass of some big river animal. The smell of mud, of primeval mud, by Jove, was in my nostrils. The high stillness of primeval forest was before my eyes. There were shiny patches on the black creek. The moon had spread over everything a thin layer of silver, over the rank grass, over the mud, upon the wall of matted vegetation, standing higher than the wall of a temple, over the great river. I could still see through a somber gap, glittering, glittering as it flowed broadly by without a murmur. All this was great, expectant, mute, while the man jabbered about himself. I wondered whether the stillness on the face of the immensity looking at us two were meant as an appeal or as a menace. What were we who had strayed in here? Could we handle that dumb thing, or would it handle us? I felt how big, how confoundedly big was that thing that couldn't talk, and perhaps was deaf as well. What was in there? I could see a little ivory coming out from there, and I had heard Mr. Kurtz was in there. I'd heard enough about it, too, God knows, yet somehow it didn't bring any image with it, no more than if I had been told an angel or a fiend was in there. I believed it in the same way one of you might believe there are inhabitants in the planet Mars. I knew once a Scotch sailmaker who was certain, dead sure, there were people in Mars. If you asked him for some idea how they looked and behaved, he would get shy and mutter something about walking on all fours. If you as much as smiled, he would, though a man of 60, offer to fight you. I would not have gone so far as to fight for Kurtz, but I went for him near enough to a lie. You know, don't forget, Marlowe is talking to his friends. You know, I hate, detest, and can't bear a lie. Not because I'm straighter than the rest of us, but simply because it appalls me. There is a taint of death, a flavor of mortality in lies, which is exactly what I hate and detest in the world, what I want to forget. It makes me miserable and sick, like biting something rotten would do. Temperament, I suppose. Think about it. Think about what a lie does to your soul. What does it do to you? Okay? Marlowe's saying it kills us. It's like death, telling a lie. It kills a little piece of you. That's the argument. So don't lie. Temperament, I suppose. Well, I went near enough to it by letting the young fool there believe anything he liked to imagine as to my influence in Europe. I became in an instant as much of a pretense as the rest of the bewitched pilgrims. This simply because I had a notion it somehow would be of help to that Kurtz, whom, at the time, I did not see. You understand? He was just a word for me. I did not see the man in the name any more than you do. Do you see him? Do you see the story? Do you see anything? It seems to me I am trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that commingling of absurdity, surprise, bewilderment, in a tremor of struggling revolt, that notion of being captured by the incredible, which is of the very essence of dreams. And our frame narrator interrupts. He was silent for a while. Notice the rhetorical questions, the series of clauses, the series of M dashes, the use of ellipses. Marlowe is struggling right now to tell this story. He didn't want to lie, but he allowed a white lie to form, to exist. He let this man believe that Marlowe was a powerful man so that he could somehow protect Kurtz, help Kurtz. Why does he need to protect or help Kurtz? Why does he need to do that? No, it is impossible. It is impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence, that which makes its truth, its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. It is impossible. We live as we dream, alone. We grow accustomed to the dark. He paused again, as if reflecting, then added, "Of course, in this, you fellows see more than I could then. You see me, whom you know. Yet Marlowe is telling the story. He thinks his friends are able to see where he's going to go with this. It had become so pitch dark that we listeners could hardly see one another. For a long time already, he, sitting apart, had been no more to us than a voice. There was not a word from anybody. The others might have been asleep, but I was awake. I listened. I listened on the watch for the sentence, for the word that would give me the clue to the faint uneasiness inspired by this narrative that seemed to shape itself without human lips in the heavy night air of the river. So, why is our frame narrator feeling uneasy by the story that he's hearing? What is making him uncomfortable? Yes, I let him run on, Marlowe began again, and think what he pleased about the powers that were behind me. I did. And there was nothing behind me. There was nothing but that wretched old mangled steamboat I was leaning against, while he talked fluently about the necessity for every man to get on. And when one comes out here, you conceive it is not to gaze at the moon. Mr. Kurtz was a universal genius. All these descriptions. Not to gaze at the moon. What does it mean to gaze at the moon, to be a moon gazer? Does that mean that you do anything? Mr. Kurtz was a universal genius, but even a genius would find it easier to work with adequate tools, intelligent men. He did not make bricks. So we're getting this bizarre conversation here between Marlowe and the brickmaker. Um, so Marlowe is the one who says, but even a genius would find it easier to work with adequate tools and intelligent men. He did not make bricks. Why? There was a physical impossibility in the way, as I was well aware. And if he did secretarial work for the manager, it was because no sensible man rejects wantonly the confidence of his superiors. Did I see it? I saw it. What more did I want? What I really wanted was rivets, by heaven. Rivets. To get on with the work, to stop the hole. Rivets. I wanted. There were cases of them down at the coast. Cases piled up, burst, split. You kicked a loose rivet,
At every second step in that station yard on the hillside, rivets had rolled into the grove of death. You could fill your pockets with rivets for the trouble of stooping down, and there wasn't one rivet to be found where it was wanted. We had plates that would do, but nothing to fasten them with. And every week the messenger, a lone Negro, letter bag on shoulder and staff in hand, left our station for the coast. And several times a week, a coast a coast caravan came in with trade goods, ghastly glazed calico that made you shudder only to look at it, glass beads value about a penny a quart, confounded spotted cotton handkerchiefs, and no rivets. Three carriers could have brought all that was wanted to set that steamboat afloat. He was becoming confidential now. So Marlowe wants rivets. What are rivets going to do for him? What do rivets do? That's something you need to explore, find out. He was becoming confidential now, but I fancy my unresponsive attitude must have exasperated him at last, for he judged it necessary to inform me he feared neither God nor devil, let alone any mere man. I said I could see that very well, but what I wanted was a certain quantity of rivets, and rivets were what really Mr. Kurtz wanted, if he'd only known it. Now, letters went to the coast every week. My dear sir, he cried, I write from dictation. I demanded rivets. There was a way for an intelligent man. He changed his manner, became very cold, and suddenly began to talk about a hippopotamus. Wondered whether sleeping on board the steamer, I stuck to my salvage night and day, I wasn't disturbed. There was an old hippo that had the bad habit of getting out on the bank and roaming at night over the station grounds. The pilgrims used to turn out in a body and empty every rifle they could lay hands on at him. Some even sat up nights for him. All this energy was wasted, though. That animal has a charmed life, he said. But you can say this only of brutes in this country. No man, you apprehend me? No man here bears a charmed life. He stood there for a moment in the moonlight, with his delicate hooked nose set a little askew and his mica eyes glittering without a wink. Then, with a curt good night, he strode off. I could see he was disturbed and considerably puzzled, which made me feel even more hopeful than I had been for days. It was a great comfort to turn from that chap to my influential friend, the battered, twisted, ruined tin pot steamboat. I clambered on board. She rang under my feet like an empty Huntley and Palmer biscuit tin kicked along a gutter. She was nothing so solid in make, and rather less pretty in shape, but I had expended enough hard work on her to make me love her. No influential friend would have served me better. She had given me a chance to come out of it, to find out what I could do. No, I don't like the work. I'd rather laze about and think of all the fine things that can be done. I don't like the work. No man does. But I like what is in the work, the chance to find yourself, your own reality, for yourself, not for others. What no other man can ever know. They can only see the mere show and never can tell what it really means. So, again, there's some interesting things that happen in this paragraph. Marlowe insults the brickmaker, calls him stupid, and then the brickmaker threatens Marlowe with this hippopotamus. And I want you to think about how is Marlowe supposed to be threatened by this story of the hippopotamus? And then finally, this last bit of business about work. No, I don't like work. Nobody likes work. No man does. But I like what is in the work, the chance to find yourself. And that's what this class, hopefully you figured out, is really all about. Finding yourself in the literature, finding for yourself what the literature means. I was not surprised to see somebody sitting aft on the deck with his legs dangling over the mud. You see, I rather chummed with the few mechanics that were there in that station, whom the other pilgrims naturally despised, on account of their imperfect manners, I suppose. This was the foreman, a boiler maker by trade, a good worker. He was a lank, bony, yellow faced man with big, intense eyes. His aspect was worried, and his head was as bald as the palm of my hand. But his hair, in falling, seemed to have stuck to his chin, and had prospered in the new locality, for his beard hung down to his waist. He was a widower with 6 young children. He had left them in charge of a sister of his to come out here, and the passion of his life was pigeon flying. He was an enthusiast and a connoisseur, He would rave about pigeons. After work hours, he used sometimes to come over from his hut for a talk about his children and his pigeons. At work, when he had to crawl in the mud under the bottom of the steamboat, he would tie up that beard of his in a kind of white serviette he brought for the purpose. It had loops to go over his ears. In the evening, he could be seen squatted on the bank, rinsing that wrapper in the creek with great care, then spreading it solemnly on a bush to dry. I slapped him on the back and shouted, "We shall have rivets!" He scrambled to his feet, exclaiming, "No, rivets!" as though he couldn't believe his ears. Then, in a low voice, "You, hey!" I don't know why. We behaved like lunatics. I put my finger to the side of my nose and nodded mysteriously. "Good for you," he cried, snapped his fingers above his head, lifting one foot. I tried a jig. We capered on the iron deck. A frightful clatter came out of that hulk, and the virgin forest on the other bank of the creek sent it back in a thundering roll upon the sleeping station. It must have made some of the pilgrims sit up in their hovels. A dark figure obscured the lighted doorway of the manager's hut, vanished. Then, a second or so after, the doorway itself vanished too. We stopped, and the silence, driven away by the stamping of our feet, flowed back again from the recesses of the land. The great wall of vegetation, an exuberant and entangled mass of trees, branches, leaves, boughs, festoons, motionless in the moonlight, was like a rioting invasion of soundless life, a rolling wave of plants, piled up, crested, ready to topple over the creek, to sweep every little man of us out of his little existence. And it moved not. A deadened burst of mighty splashes and snorts reached us from afar, as though an ichthyosaurus had been taking a bath of glitter in the great river. "After all," said the Boilermaker in a reasonable tone, "why shouldn't we get rivets?" "Why not, indeed? I did not know of any reason why we shouldn't." "They'll come in 3 weeks," I said confidently. But they didn't. Instead of rivets, there came an invasion, an infliction, a visitation. It came in sections during the next 3 weeks, each section headed by a donkey carrying a white man in new clothes and tan shoes, bowing from that elevation right and left to the impressed pilgrims. The quarrelsome band of footsore, sulky negroes trod on the heels of the donkey. A lot of tents, camp stools, tin boxes, white cases, brown bales would be shot down in the courtyard, and the air of mystery would deepen a little over the muddle of the station. 5 such installments came, with their absurd air of disorderly flight, with the loot of innumerable outfit shops and provision stores that one would think they were lugging after a raid into the wilderness for equitable division. It was an inextricable mess of things, decent in themselves, but that human folly made look like the spoils of thieving. This devoted band called itself the El Dorado Exploring Expedition, and I believe they were sworn to secrecy. Their talk, however, was the talk of sordid buccaneers. It was reckless without hardihood, greedy without audacity, and cruel without courage. There was not an atom of foresight or of serious intention in the whole batch of them, and they did not seem aware these things are wanted for the work of the world. To tear treasure out of the bowels of the land was their desire, with no more moral purpose at the back of it than there is in burglars breaking into a safe. Who paid the expenses of the noble enterprise? I don't know, but the uncle of our manager was leader of that lot. In exterior, he resembled a butcher in a poor neighborhood. In his eyes had a look of sleepy cunning. He carried his fat paunch with ostentation on his short legs, and during the time his gang infested the station, spoke to no one but his nephew. You could see these two roaming about all day, with their heads close together in an everlasting confab. I had given myself up. I had given up worrying myself about the rivets. One's capacity for that kind of folly is more limited than you would imagine, I suppose. I said hang and let things slide. I had plenty of time for meditation, and now and then I would give some thought to Kurtz. I wasn't very interested in him. No. Still, I was curious to see whether this man, who had come out equipped with moral ideas of some sort, would climb to the top after all, and how he would set about his work when there. So we'll stop there. It's a little longer than I'd hoped, about 20 minutes longer. I did have to pause for the dog. But yeah, so be thinking about this El Dorado exploring expedition. It seems particularly timely for me, but that's prejudice, perhaps. And this whole bit of business about the rivets. Right. All right, I forgot to tell you what page we're on. So this is the end of section one. And the end of section one or section two begins at page 23. We went from 23 to about 38, so not very far. Um, yeah, so, and let me know, in your notes, comments, thoughts, what have you. Am I giving too much? Is it not enough? Is it just right? Okay, give me those thoughts as well.